right, welcome everyone to the latest installment here of our Wednesday walks through Culver history here at Culver Academy's History Facebook page every Wednesday at 4. I'm Jeff Kenney, Culver Academy's Museum and Archives manager, and behind the camera, once more, thanks to him, is Jerry Nye, class of 1957. And we're here, obviously, on the shore of Lake Maxinkuckee. We happen to be sitting on the Naval Pier. And this is really probably going to be our farewell to summer episode or segment. This is really the end of Culver summer, of course, as we're preparing for the winter school or boarding school season to start. And so we have a special guest today I'm excited about, and we're just going to launch into today you might call them ships of the line, the vessels, the boats that make up such an integral part of Culver's naval program. And of course, the summer naval school really kicked off Culver's summer programs in general. 1902, so just 8 years after Culver Military Academy opens in 1894. We've talked about that in several segments this summer. But again, we're going to focus in today on the boats. Now, we don't have many boats to look at today, of course, as we're still in this COVID-19 coronavirus summer. Even the R.H. Ledbetter, which we'll talk about, is not out on the water this summer, or else we'd be sitting by it. But we are going to harken back to some memories and talk about some still current matters in the Naval School. So when the Naval School begins in 1902, it's really got a very small fleet, just a handful, less than 10, of 10-oar cutters. These are large cutters, the likes of which we haven't seen in many years here at Culver. These are about a ton or more each. They're large boats, and if you know the famous story of the Logansport flood and its rescue, those are the boats that are utilized. You can fit some 30-plus people in those boats, so they're quite substantial. Really, you don't begin to see power boats for a few years after that, into the teens in the 1920s. So one of these early power boats is one named the Admiral Ross. It's named for the head of the Naval School. It's in the 1920s, Admiral Ross. Another prominent one was a signal boat called the Ohio that functioned here in the 1920s and 30s. And another that's really going to become one of the legends of Culver's fleet is one that starts out called the Regina. And it's the largest boat on the lake when Culver acquires it. It's a 55-foot long diesel-powered boat. And many of you of a certain vintage may remember it better as the Admiral Rodman. It's renamed in 1936 in honor of Admiral Hugh Rodman, who's another naval legend here at Culver. Of course, a very significant event happens in Culver's naval history in 1938. And Rodman obviously escaped this fate, but Culver's boathouse, which was located approximately where the rowing center is today on the east end of campus, had been the airplane hangar. Culver's boathouse burns to the ground in 1938, taking with it almost the entire naval fleet that belonged to the school. So that's obviously a, no pun intended, sea change for the school. But the Rodman does survive. It was not in the building when the fire took place. One boat that many of you will remember, we're going to talk about in a little more detail here in a minute, is the O.W. Fowler. It's named for Commander Ori Fowler, who was the executive officer of the Naval School from the 20s into 1938. Then he's the head of the summer school from 38 till his death in 1942. But in 1941, the head of Culver's boathouse, Bud Craft, designs this beautiful boat. The Fowler, at 54 feet long, really kind of the flagship of the program. Again, that continues to this day in a certain sense. We'll talk about that. And in 1943, the first official Moonlight Serenade takes place on the deck of the Fowler. Moonlight Serenade was a huge tradition for Culver summer schools, continues to be. It was a tourist destination around the state even by the 1940s, started under Colonel Payson as the band director for the Naval Band in the summer, and of course winter school band. And as many of you know, of course, Moonlight Serenade, the Naval Band serenades folks on the shore, or cottagers around Lake Maxinkuckee during that full moon in July. Another iconic boat debuts in 1942, and that's the Revluck. If you haven't figured it out, the Revluck is Culver spelled backwards. This is B.B. Culver, Bertram Culver, grandson of the founders, personal boat that he donates to the school. It's another power boat. It served the school into the late 1960s, and it is sunk off Perry's Point on the east shore of Lake Maxinkuckee, and has been a destination for scuba diving in the years since then. So we have a very special guest today who's going to bring a lot of firsthand knowledge, past and present, about Culver's naval program and boats. Well, I want to welcome Tim Miller. Many of you know him. Tim, thanks for being willing to join us today. And You've got a lot of information you can share, but first, can you just tell us a little bit about your relationship to the program here?
Wow. It starts back in 1963 when I came here. That was my first summer here, so third classman. As I mentioned, Jeff Kenney and I are in the same class of 65. And just, I don't know, this place has been such a huge part of my life since 1963. So I was on staff all through the years that I was in college, other years in the 70s, I kind of missed the 80s and 90s, but then came back late 90s, and my daughter was here in Woodcraft, and then we thought, I'll kind of do a while there. And so, 21 years later, I'm still here.
Okay.
So it's been a labor of love over, I've kind of lost track of how many summers now. And then 2 winters. I was here in 77 through 79 as counselor for B.
So, right around the same time the Rodman goes away, I guess you could say its replacement was the Yarnell. Named for Harry Yarnell, who had been Naval School director for a time in the 1940s. This is another diesel-powered boat, and it's essentially a small replica warship, right, Tim?
Say it was a model destroyer. It actually had twin engines.
Okay.
And it was a model destroyer, so that you could teach ship handling and all that neat stuff.
That's right. So it kind of filled the role the Rodman had before it. It's not a sailboat; it's a navigation and steering. And
it was really designed. It was the first class boat. So if you think of the Fowler as being the second class boat, because to be on Fowler crew you had to be a second classman, and the first classman really had nothing. So they brought the Yarnell on, and to be Yarnell crew required you to be a first classman. Okay. And then a lot of the navigation instruction was done on the Yarnell. Yeah. These boats to me are associated with people. And so the person that just stands out of my mind on the Yarnell, as well as other aspects, was Captain Melville Short. And I worked for Captain Short in seamanship. He was my boss for, 6 summers. But those who remember him know what a character he was. A retired Coast Guard captain. He loved the Yarnell, but his biggest passion outside of swords and fencing was teaching people how to row. Okay. And everybody from that era will remember Captain Short with "feather your oars" was his favorite command, and just a real character.
Tim, were you on staff when, I believe it was 1979, the Yarnell sank briefly?
No, my last year in that stretch was 78.
Okay.
So I was not here. I knew it sank, and they raised it, and they used it a few more years, and it was just to the point they couldn't.
Right, 83 is kind of an important year, both for the Yarnell, that's its last summer, and the original Fowler, which had a wood hull, correct?
Correct.
And so its replacement, maybe you could talk about a little bit, is the R.H. Ledbetter.
So the Ledbetter family out of Rome, Georgia, agreed to fund the money to build the replacement. Probably most people looking at this realize that it just went through a refurbishing and relaunching. The year of the centennial, when it did the cruise up the East Coast,
yes,
it was in salt water.
Right.
And unfortunately, salt water got into the hull, and over the course of the next X years, caused significant rust damage.
Yeah, so I think the Ledbetter family was again at the forefront of that restoration just in the last couple of years. The centennial, of course, is 2002, and you're referring to that ocean voyage going up the East Coast in celebration of that. Another interesting facet of the Ledbetter is that, as far as we know, we've been told it's the largest 3-masted ship of its kind on freshwater in the United States. I don't know if we can substantiate that, but that's what we're told.
To my knowledge, it's the only fully rigged square rigger on fresh water in the world. Okay. Not simply the largest boat, there may be larger boats, but it's fully rigged, which means it has 15 sails. So it's a 3-masted, fully rigged, and to my knowledge, it's the only one of its kind in the world that sits on fresh water.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of your memories of Culver's fleet and just changes you've seen over the years, both from kind of a former student perspective and a staff perspective.
Certainly seen a lot of changes. if I go back to when I was here, and we were talking earlier, we were an honor naval school, and so we actually had Navy chiefs and a naval officer from NROTC on staff during the summer, and they alternated between Purdue and Notre Dame, and they were here to teach navigation. So if you were your third year, your first class year, you weren't really sailing, you were on the Yarnell, you were doing sextants, you were doing all the navigation stuff, and the chiefs and the officer added such a color and reality to this place about, wow, I mean, these guys are real Navy, even though we had real Navy, but we had Admiral Bays, who was up in the office, and occasionally you got to see him, but it wasn't the flavor of these guys are doing it day in and day out. So they were just, they really added so much to the program. So if I go back to '63, the fleet consisted of what we called cat boats, which was just a simple one sail rig, and that was a large part of them, and they were actually built here.
Right.
We built them. So we had the cat boats, which was beginning sailing. We had the Rebels, which to this day were one of my favorite boats. They just looked sleek, and they were red hulled and blue sails. We had Vikings, which were actually kind of unique. They were wood, but they were keel boats, so they had a lead keel. And in this lake, as the summer would get down and the lake would get lower, you really couldn't go anywhere because they'd get stuck.
Right.
And then we had Lightnings. The Lightning is a boat that we still have to this day. Of all the different changes in class of boats, the Lightning has maintained its presence at Culver over the years. And of course we had the scows. If you leave Indiana or the Midwest and you go someplace to talk about a scow, nobody's going to have a clue what you're talking about. It is very much a Midwest boat. We had C's and E's and an A scow. Huge boat, blue top, crew of, 7, 8. And it was so fast that it took you no time to get to the other end of the lake. You just flew down there, tack around, fly back, tack around, fly back, and it was just a blast. See, again, now speaking of those boats, I got to think of the two people that in my era were the top sailors, and that would be Pat Hodgkins and Jerry Thomas. I mean, they were just the sailing masters. And actually, after the cutters, when the cutters went away, we went to the surf boats, and those were built here. If you go over to the boathouse, you can still see the mold up in the rafters.
Interesting.
Which was the other boat that we actually sailed.
Okay.
So you had naval competition, and from the standpoint of basic sailing, beginning sailing, they would put the mast up on the crew boat, and your instructor would take you out. That would be your first introduction to sailing before you could ever get in a cat boat. I'll come back to the cat boats in a minute. So you were taught how to sail on a surf boat.
Okay.
And they were slow and lumbersome, and kids raced them on Saturday afternoons. And when I was on staff and we were still doing that, that was my naval duty, was surf boat sailing on Saturday afternoons. One of the biggest differences then, and even into the 70s, is that a lot of the naval staff were winter school faculty.
Right.
The faculty worked year-round.
Yes. Yes.
So we when I came on, we were the college supplements to the full-time staff.
Well, one of the things we also talked about was there was a kind of a sweeping effort here to update and kind of add to the naval sort of fleet more recently.
Right.
And folks who walk along the shoreline will see plaques honoring the donors to that effort.
That was a significant effort. Of course, the cat boats went away. To the extent the Rebels went away, they went to O'Day's, which was a straight scoop rig boat. And they used those for a number of years. They introduced Hobie cats. They tried the Hobie cats. A guy by the name of Jerry Neiman introduced lasers to the Academy. So we wound up with a huge laser fleet. When I came back at the end of the 90s, 2000, the fleet was pretty ragged. I mean, we had too many students for not enough seats, and the whole thing was, having seats on the boat. They had transitioned to an interlake, which is a perfect boat for us, which is what we have today too. We've added to the interlake fleet substantially. The boat was built by one guy in Toledo, Ohio. So without a doubt, we have the largest interlake fleet in the country. To that, we have added lasers, the 420s, which are behind us. And the 420s serve a dual purpose, not only for the summer, but they are also the boat that is raced by high schools during the season.
Right.
So since we now have a varsity sailing program, we have a substantial number of 420s. The other teams love to come here for our regatta because without a doubt our 420s are in the best shape, the best maintained, and the quantity. So they love coming here. We still have lightnings, and we have our keel boats. And keel boats were a new addition. These are actually small little cabin cruisers. And all of this came about through a group that was put together and headed by John Ziegler to refund and rebuild the fleet. So the biggest change that happened was we affiliated with U.S. Sailing, which is the governing body of sailing in the United States and has a set curriculum. So now everything here is based on the U.S. Sailing curriculum. We still have maintained that naval school, that honor naval school rating. So when the kids graduate, both the males and the females, if they did 3 years in the naval school, they not only get a Culver diploma, but they also get a certificate from the Department of Navy showing successful completion.
Well, one thing we talked about, and I think is a good thing to touch on, we're sitting now on a newer, I mean, the years have gone quickly, but so I think of it as still somewhat new, but it's been several years now, this floating pier. So we've gone through some changes in the dock itself here at the Naval Pier.
Right. I look at the pictures way back when the naval building was actually the end of the pier, built like a ship, and the admiral was whistled on, and the whole rigmarole.
Every summer they built that thing at the end of the dock. That's right. As you say, and just to date it for this video, up until about 48, when the naval building is dedicated, that was the headquarters.
So this pier, the floating pier, is really beautiful. It's great for, I don't know how many years we had the wooden pier. Actually, this is going out this way. The wooden pier went out that way. Just like, again, during my tenure as a student and as staff, this is primarily in the 70s, late 60s and 70s. But what the naval school, the highlight of first class summer was always the first class sail. So, you got a boat and your girlfriend, and it's at night, and you're out there on the lake looking at the stars, and it's just fun. It's just very special. And then the other thing that we kind of touched on was for a number of years, and it got stopped for safety reasons and other things, we would do a 24-hour cruise. So kids would do like a 2-hour watch, and they'd have to get up, they'd have to report down here, and we would keep the Fowler, Ledbetter, whichever boat we were using, Yarnell, operating 24 hours. Just to try and get some sense of a real experience.
Yeah.
I sit out here and I look at those pictures of the naval building and the people we've been talking about, like Captain Bolton and Admiral Bays and Captain Whitney and those gentlemen. And the 5, 6 years I was director of the naval school, it just seems, I don't even belong in that group. But that is such an incredible group. And I think of other directors like Bob Stockwell, who did at least 2 different stints here as naval school director and had such an impact on this program. That's just like, there's been such real talent that's been in those positions that Culver's been blessed to have men of that caliber doing.
Absolutely, yeah.
I've been blessed because of all the kids that I've had as students and then came back as staff and have maintained as friends now for 20 plus years.
Again, thanks so much to Tim Miller for being here, giving us the depth of perspective, no pun intended, that we definitely wouldn't have had otherwise. And hopefully we'll be back at it next summer, full speed ahead. And again, thanks to Jerry Nye, class of '57, for his work behind the camera. I'm Jeff Kenney, Culver Academy's Museum and Archives Manager. We're here every Wednesday at 4 on the Culver Academy's History Facebook page, as well as on our Culver History Vimeo channel, if you want to look at archive videos, and the Digital Vault for more archive video. And we hope to see you here next week.